let's talk about the remaining parts of our constitution. Part 11. Part 11 talks about relations between the union and the states. Now we have, as I said, powers are distributed between union and the states, and to prevent the clash between these two power centers, they have written some provisions so they handle their powers without any clash. First chapter talks about legislative relations, and like certain things like subject matters of laws made by parliament and by legislators and states, like what sub and like on what fields can parliament make laws and what fields can legislatures of state can make laws, things like that. And it also talks about residuary powers, like if certain subject is not mentioned in any way, so it comes, where should it come under, so things like that, come under this. It even talks about international agreements, like if India has entered into some kind of international agreement, then who under whose authority that comes under, things like that. Chapter 2 talks about administrative relations, and what else? Okay, certain, then under that we have certain things like disputes related to waters, like what should happen if two states fight for a single river and something like that, like how to handle those situations. Those are handled here in this article 262. Okay, that's it regarding relations between union and the state. We'll go into details later on. Okay, next thing is part 11, part 12, sorry. Part 12 talks about finance, property, contracts and suits. All these are like finance related topics, how tax are imposed and how and where do tax go, like contingency fund, like what is consolidated fund, like this is a fund where all the tax income goes into. Article 266 talks about that. And contingency fund, this is some kind of emergency fund. Article 267 talks about that. I mean, all these things come under this part. It talks about how taxes are levied and all that. This part talks about all those things, and it even talks about finance commission. We all know this article 280 talks about finance commission and what to do with the recommendations given by finance commissions and all that. We'll get into details later. This is about that. And we have chapter 2 about borrowings, like details related to borrowings by government of India and states and all that. Okay, next is chapter 4, that is right to property 300A. We all know earlier right to property was a fundamental right, but later on it was removed and added as a separate chapter over here. So it is still a constitutional right but not a fundamental right, so that's it. Okay, next is part 13. Part 13 talks about trade, commerce and intercourse within the territory of India. Like it talks about free trade, commerce and all that between states and all that, like how trade can be done and what are the restrictions, on trade between states and how they can conduct trade. This all comes under part 13. Okay, next important, actually this is important part 14. This talks about services under the union and the state. So we all know the UPSC is Union State Commission, and every state has got its own public service commission. So this part talks about all that, like how the members of those commissions are elected, and what is their duration and what is the process of removal and what are their responsibilities and duties, things like that. So that's it. It ends till here 323, and after that we have part 14A. It talks about tribunals. Tribunals are some kind of special courts. So 323A talks about administrative tribunals. So like if some member in the administration has got a problem, then he can approach these tribunals, and this talks about some extra tribunals. Article 323B. Okay, next comes part 15. Part 15 talks about elections. It's like who conducts election and who is eligible for elections and stuff like that, things like that. Next comes part 16. Part 16 talks about special provisions related to certain classes. Like our government has provided certain extra provisions for certain classes, like scheduled class, scheduled tribes, and for Anglo Indians and all that. Like some kind of reservation in legislatures and parliament. Like this part talks about all that. This part also talks about these two. These two are important commissions: National Commission for Scheduled Castes and National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, 338 and 338 8A. Okay, next important part is part 17. This talks about official language. Talks about language of the union, regional language, and all that. Talks about language that can be used in the Supreme Court, High Court, and all that. We'll come into to the details later regarding these official languages. Next very important part is part 18. This talks about emergency provisions. We all know this talks about what all types of emergency cases might arise, and how to proclaim emergency, and how to continue an emergency, and how to stop an emergency. This part talks about all those things till 360. Okay, part 19 talks about some miscellaneous means mixed provisions, like some extra provisions. It's like governors and Raj Pramukhs. Like Raj Pramukh, they used to be there earlier. Right now, there are no Raj Pramukhs. There's some kind of extra part. Okay, next talks about part 20. Part 20. This is a very important part. This talks about amendment of the constitution. This talks about article 368. This is very important. It talks about how our constitution can be amended and all that. Next comes part 21. Part 21 talks about some temporary transitional special provisions, like this one, article 370. It talks about some special provisions for the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Similarly, there are some special provisions for several other states as well. So this talks about these special provisions, this part 21. Okay. Next comes part 22. Part 22 is a very small part. It talks about short title, or the short title of the constitution commencement, when it's going to be come into commencement, and it talks about authoritative text in Hindi, like some kind of Hindi translations and all that. These articles talk about those. So that's it. 395 is the last article. Okay, we'll talk about schedules in our next